Hi, everybody. My name is Lily Speckler, and I'm a senior at the University of the District of Columbia. I'm so sorry I wasn't able to come share in person this year, but I'm glad I was able to share my presentation this way. So the topic I'm going over today is food consumption decreased amongst US adults during the COVID-19 pandemic. The funding source, this research project was funded by the University of the District of Columbia Agricultural Experiment Station with funding from the Hatch Multi-State Research Capacity Funding Program from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Thanks to my mentor, Dr. Lord, who made all of this research possible. So the coronavirus disease began in 2019, and this pandemic sent millions of people worldwide into lockdown, resulting in widespread changes to daily life and routines. And with so much systemic changes, it's not surprising that the food intake would have been impacted as well. So as you can see from this map, which is from the CDC, all of these areas that are highlighted are hotspots. So at the height of the pandemic, when it first broke out, about 80% of the US population was affected by this. So a lot of people. And just a few highlights from the literature review. So the pandemic food outcomes have really been different during different stages of the pandemic. Meaning if you looked at the way the patterns were at the very start of the pandemic, they were quite different compared to a little bit later in the pandemic. For example, when COVID-19 first broke out, a lot of people were nervous that it was coming from a seafood market. So as a result, there was a widespread aversion to seafood and other meat products. In the beginning of the pandemic, there was also a lot of purchasing of unusual materials. So there was a lot of hoarding going on. People were buying a lot more toilet paper than they usually do, food in cans more than they usually do. And the shelves were cleared as people were stockpiling their food. As the pandemic went on, especially post-vaccine, that happened less and less. People were not hoarding as much and not stockpiling as much, and weren't making as strange purchases compared to the beginning of lockdown. In the start of lockdown, food security actually briefly went up due to all of these government benefits that rolled out. And so that was a little bit different compared to a later stage in the pandemic when those government benefits expired. Being home more, a lot of people were home a lot more than they were when they were working full-time and commuting full-time. So that actually resulted in decreased fast food intake and an increase in healthy food consumption. And in addition to that, a lot of research studies concluded that there was an increase in snacking. So a lot of experts chalk that up to psychological distress, but some people were baking a little bit more than they usually did prior to the pandemic. As the pandemic went on, financial uncertainty began to grow more and more, and temporary benefit packages went away. So things changed a little bit later into the pandemic. And while supply chains were the most dramatic at the start of the pandemic, supply chain disruptions, as the pandemic went on, those still did remain. So we've still been having some supply chain disruptions. So the objective of this study was to examine how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the dietary habits of adults in the United States. So as for materials and methods, this study design was cross-sectional. We used R to analyze the data, and a dietary screening tool was used to survey 10,035 individuals in the US aged 40 to 100 using the software Qualtrics. Data was collected from August through September of 2020. And the foods that we surveyed for included the My Plate items, which are over here on the right. So fruit, grains, dairy, protein, and vegetables. And in addition to that, we also surveyed for fat and sweets and snacks. Pre and since pandemic responses were compared using the Wilcoxon signed ring test and McNamara test. So for our results, the demographic breakdown, we had 42.6% male and 57.4% female. In terms of income, 25.5% of our participants earned $100,000 per year or more, and 24.9% of our participants earned below $35,000 per year. For our racial breakdown, 7% of our participants were Asian, 13.9% were African American, 4.3% were Hispanic, and 73.6% were white. 1.3% preferred not to answer. And the way that this compared to the US population, so this data is from 2021 from the US Census Bureau, and the way that breaks down in the US is 76.3% of US citizens are white, 13.4% are Black or African American, 18.5% are Hispanic. So that's a little bit different than our numbers, which is only 4.3%, and 5.9% of US citizens are Asian. So aside from the Hispanic population in this study, pretty comparable to the US population. In terms of education, 28.6% of our participants had a bachelor's degree, and 47.8% of our participants had less than a bachelor's degree. So now getting into our actual results. The category that saw the biggest decrease was in consumption was grains. So as you can see, that's a pretty dramatic drop from 2.06 before the pandemic going to 1.92 since the pandemic. And that's how often do you usually eat whole grain breads. So definitely a big decrease there. For sweets and snacks, our results were actually contrary to what I found in the literature review, which is that overall sweet and snacks consumption did go down. So as you can see, before and since, all of these numbers are dropping. So overall, we found that our participants were snacking less. As for fat consumption, that also went down. So do you usually add butter or margarine to foods like bread and rolls or biscuits? That number saw a drop. A little bit smaller of a decrease in these second two questions here. So gravy was not much of a change at all. And do you usually add fat to potatoes and other vegetables? That was a very small decrease, but it still was a decrease. So interestingly enough, vegetables saw the smallest change before and since pandemic. And there's a few different reasons why that could be. As far as what the literature review is showing, a lot more people were nervous about getting sick. So they wanted to improve their immune systems. That could be part of it. Another possible reason is that with fewer funds to spend on groceries, people were more likely to try to buy a few healthier items compared to maybe before when they got more of a mix. And also, I think the government benefits might have also helped here. For proteins, one of my colleagues is going to go over proteins in depth, so I'm not going to go too much into this, but to sum it up, this category also saw a drop from before to since. In terms of dairy, dairy also saw a drop. So how many servings of milk, cheese, or yogurt do you usually have per day? Before 2.17 and then since 2.15. So that's a significant decrease. And the milk saw a smaller decrease before and since, but there still was a decrease in that category as well. Fruit, fruit didn't see as big of a decrease compared to, fruit saw a bigger decrease compared to vegetables. So as you can see, that's a pretty significant drop from before to since pandemic values. And that's in all three categories. So how often do you usually eat fruit as a snack? That went down. How often do you eat fruit? Please include fresh, canned, or frozen fruit. That dropped. And this saw the smallest decrease down here, but there still was a decrease. And that question was, how often do you drink some kind of juice at breakfast? So alcohol also saw a decrease in consumption. Part of the reason why maybe could be the bars were closed, so there's less social interaction, less opportunity to drink alcohol. And before was 48.2, and then since was 46.9. And supplements didn't see a huge decrease. That level is pretty similar before and since the pandemic. So here are my references. And I'm so sorry I'm not able to answer questions in person, but if you reach out to me, you can through Dr. Schweitzer or Dr. Lord, and I would love to answer any questions you might have about this research. Thank you.